Thank you for joining us on the program and a warm welcome. The 33rd Summit of Heads of State of the African Union opens this Sunday on February 9. Dozens of heads of state and government are expected in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, which houses the organization's headquarters. Among the highlights of the meeting, the call for more African solidarity, for a demanding objective, the silencing of arms. To be exact, is captioned in the theme, silencing the weapons that creates silencing weapons and creating conditions that are conducive to the development of Africa.
Exactly, Jerry. This summit will allow for Egypt, who is the current chair of the AU, to make way for South Africa. Of course, we wait to see the impact that the arrival of the Southern African nation will have on the Pan-African organization. But for now, we speak to Marshall Zebelinga, an economist and sociologist, who can expand more on the theme chosen this year by the African Union. Good morning, Mr. Belinga. The African heads of state are meeting this weekend in Ethiopia, and on the table of discussion is the question of creating conditions for the development of the continent. And this is not a new theme. Some would even say that it's been discussed for years. So do you think that in 2020 it is a failure to approach these things? I think that we should be careful not to overinterpret the theme of the meeting. The theme is much more precise. They talk about silencing the guns, conditions for economic development. So there's a relationship between the security situation and the improvement of the economic and living conditions of the African people. In essence, have development strategies failed since the 1960s? I think it is almost certain, even if there has been some progress here and there. On the whole, however, we are still working on a set of strategies that have not enabled the continent to achieve a level of development and improve the living conditions of its people.
And I really do like how you mentioned that, especially because the next question I was going to ask you is on the paradox that comes to mind when we say Africa is the continent of the future with positive growth rates, but also with ever more jobless people. The states accused of going into dangerous debt for infrastructure, and also youth wanting to leave to Europe or America, and some, in fact, are taken to arms.
Well, the explanation comes first of all from the interpretation that a large part of the African elite talk about growth using Western watchwords or trending phrases. Whether we speak of Africa emerging or Africa rising, notice that these are concepts and ideas that come from the Western world. And when we say African growth or Africa emerging, we should dig deeper to understand whether those who say it are talking about an Africa that emerged for itself or for others. And when you look at the concept of emergence, for example, if you only take this one, which was born in the 80s when international finance was looking for external opportunities, the concept of emergence does not in any way mean that Africans will get a better Africa. It simply means that Africa is going to have a size and a financial service that is to produce gains for the international community. The same is true when Westerners say that Africa is a continent of the future. It does not mean that Africans will get a better Africa. It means that Africa will be a better market for the West. So, if we want to be less theoretical and more active, what models can we use that have been successful on the continent? Well, on one hand, the news isn't terrible because we haven't changed course. The level of development is what I'm talking about. There are still major shortcomings, but there are a number of initiatives. We can see that some countries today are making progress and they have their own progressive initiatives. Let's speak of Rwanda, for instance. Not only because it is growing, but also because it is a country where there is a real leadership on economic issues, environmental issues, and so on. What we can take as positive elements is political leadership, but especially an elitist leadership in general. We have to tackle that. We can't have progress if there's elitism. Rwanda has its weaknesses because it depends on a lot of foreign aid, but it shows that leadership is important. Look at Ghana, for instance, which is diversifying its exports. It's also growing significantly and reaching political cycles of renewal. Its political class is also paving the way forward. Its weakness, however, is still in the pattern that depends a lot on raw materials. But we can see that with improved governance of institutions, there can be a lot of progress in these countries I've mentioned, as well as on the African continent at large.
Martial, to my last question, do you think that the negotiations with international financial institutions and the conditions which they pose to the release of funds, do they really present concrete advantages to African countries?
Well, you know very well that the so-called international financial organizations, whether the IMF or the World Bank, are institutions which were created after the Second World War and were objectively created to support the reconstruction of Europe, Western reconstruction, and Western economic development. What we don't actually see is that we have huge internal resources within Africa. The idea that we should go through major international financiers is a problem. It's problematic. Just an example, a figure between 1980 and 2010, according to the AFDB calculations, is that $1.2 trillion and $1.5 trillion of capital escaped the African continent, and this outgoing capital could largely offset what we expect in terms of international aid. We have another big example. Today, we know that flows from the diaspora, the Africans that are in the diaspora, that amount of money sent home to invest is more important than international aid. So we must get out of these economies that are predated and move towards using our own internal sources. And internal resources are also financial resources. We must therefore work to recover and to be able to find direct resources within our African continent that will improve our different sectors.